of poetry as articulated in his essay titled The Government of the Tongue. Referring to an episode in John's Gospel, he writes, "In one sense, the efficacy of poetry is nil. No lyric has ever stopped a tongue. In another sense, it is unlimited. It is like the writing in the sand in the face of which accusers and accused are left speechless and renewed." He emphasizes that poetry does not promise that now a solution will take place. Instead, quote, "In the rift between what is going to happen and whatever we would wish to happen, poetry holds attention for space, functions not as distraction but as pure concentration, a focus where our power to concentrate is concentrated back on ourselves," unquote. We believe that it is the awareness of this space and rift in time which should be reappreciated as the forgotten gift of poetry and its true leverage as we face the climactic disaster and are too often left speechless by the scale of what's happening. In the first study, I'm going to focus on Seamus Heaney's poetic sequence titled Squarings, which was published in his 1991 collection, Seeing Things. This sequence, consisting of 48 poems or 576 lines, represents Heaney's most extensive work up to date. And in its sheer scope and lyrical operation, it maximizes the contemplative space and potential for the reader. This sequence takes up practically the whole second half of the collection and consists of 48 poems divided into 4 sections: lightnings, settings, crossings, and squarings. Each section contains 12 douzaines, or simply 12 liners, and the resulting pattern is more or less a perfect squaring of 12 lines by 12 poems in each section, 4 sections squaring up the total. In this sequence, the zone of consciousness, as presented in the vibrant tapestry of the 48 vignettes, emerges as supremely receptive and reflective of its environment, extending, as I'm going to discuss in further detail, both in terms synchronic and diachronic. In his seminal lecture titled The Redress of Poetry, Heaney articulates this expansive, generous embrace, stating explicitly that, quote, "Poetry has to be a working model of inclusive consciousness, and that it should not simplify." He envisions its projections and inventions as nothing less than a match for the complex reality which surrounds it and out of which it is generated. In its constant emphasis on the porousness and luminosity of this consciousness as it dwells in the world and communicates with its environment, this expansive meditation becomes a supreme lyrical rendering of Bill Plotkin's observation, quote, "Psyche is not separate from nature, not separate from the world. Rather, psyche is an attribute of each thing in the world," unquote. Before I turn to the constitutive principles which make this sequence an environmentally alert and reflective zone of consciousness, I should add that drafting Squarings, Heaney felt a very strong guarantee of the truth of things as portrayed and expressed in this envisioned long poem. This, what I call guarantee here, came quite unexpectedly and much to the poet's delight as the intimation of form to work with and in. Heaney recalled the first stirrings of the form in an interview in 2008, and he said this, quote, "I was sitting in this most beautiful reading room in the National Library of Ireland with the rain coming down on the glass dome. Suddenly, I wrote a few lines, and it became a 12-line, 4-3 lines thing. It felt given, strange, and unexpected. I didn't quite know where it came from, but I knew immediately it was there to stay. I may exaggerate, but I do not misrepresent if I say that in general, I was subject to the poems and not the other way around." End quote. I believe that this guarantee of form liberated Heaney's expression, which suddenly free of the previous constraints and anxieties, could roam the territory of the self and life reflecting consciousness with much more freedom, curiosity, and ease. What I see as the two main strategies operating in the sequence as it explores this territory with renewed impulse and works towards the maximum contemplative circumference are first, diachronic deepening, and second, synchronic synthesizing. The diachronic deepening follows the birth and gradual expansiveness of the individual consciousness. This cognitive ontogenesis is visualized through the recurrent image of a home or house, as it is revisited at various points in the sequence. The structure of a house seems to be the initial visual impetus, which prompted drafting of squarings, as the poet recalls his existence in the late 1980s, especially following the death of both of his parents, as dominated by the feeling of quote-unquote unroofing. This unroofing as a shorthand for a profoundly reorienting experience, an imperative for re-evaluation of one's perspective, becomes the introductory image of the whole sequence. This invitation to revisit and experience new wholeness is presenting Enlightenings 1, which is the initial poem in the sequence, as, quote, unroofed scope, unquote, and, quote, gazing out from far away, end quote. The knowledge-freshening wind can finally enter. The heart might have been rained into, but the, quote, bright puddle, unquote, now becomes the ground where, quote, the soul-free cloud life roams, end quote. This emphatic unbearing in revisiting propels the retrospective journey of the central consciousness. Enlightenings 2, it exhorts itself, quote, roof it again, batten down, dig in, end quote. However, this is an exhortation to work towards clarity, not circumscription. Quote, sink every impulse like a bolt, secure the bastion of sensation. Do not waver into language, do not waver in it, end quote. This increasingly embodied and re-evaluated nostos comes to its most definite rendering in Squarings 40. Here the memory of a little boy playing on the clay floor turns into a vision, both ultimately physical and eternal. Time is compromised. Quote, I was 4, but I turned 400 maybe 4,000 even, end quote. And the individual ontology collapses in the point of its origin. Quote, ground of being, body's deep obedience to all its shifting tenses, end quote. The process of homecoming in aesthetic terms has been completed as the observant consciousness is witnessed coming alive. Quote, a half door opening directly into starlight, end quote. The consciousness is rippling out from its original center to be the same at its circumference decades later in a doorway, as we have seen in Enlightenings 1. This moment on the kitchen floor from the early childhood is identified as the origin of his consciousness by the poet himself. He recalled, quote, I will never forget that contact of warm skin and cold floor, the immediate sensation of surprise, and then something deeper, more gradual, a sensation of consolidation and familiarity, the whole reassuring foundation of the earth coming up into you through the soles of your feet. It was like a knowledge coming home to you, end quote. Taking out the bottom of his cot to encounter, quote, the ancient dampish feel of a clay floor, end quote, figures as the original and ultimate unflooring. In diachronic terms, the mind's self-authorized expansion, as it removes the obstacles that would impose limits on its processing, seems achieved. To support and anchor the synchronic view of the mind's extending capacity, I propose that we perceive consciousness in Squarings as a dynamic and unique juncture, which is formed as the physical body is temporarily united and infused with spirit in the individual life. While the realm of the physical body and the realm of the spiritual element might be extending beyond this consciousness, circumference, and comprehension, it is nevertheless this consciousness which effectively mediates between the two poles or two orders, and serving as a point of contact between their particular impulses, communicates the sense of wholeness of the human existence. It is this consciousness re-emerging in the awareness of its full sensitivity and potential which is presented in Squarings. Combining elements tangible, solid with lightweight, airy ones, Heaney reaches a fascinating level of experiential confrontation and shifting intimacy. This intensity and interaction are introduced in the very first lines of the sequence as the winter light falls, quote, in a doorway and on the stone doorstep, entering, as it were, the solidities of the poem's terrain. In the quarry scene in Lightning's 10, we watch, quote, the cargoed brightness traveling, end quote, as the clouded sky and puddled water piece out their unfathomable elements reflecting each other. A series of queries comes echoing up, quote, could you reconcile what was diaphanous there with what was massive? Were you equal to or were you opposite to build-ups so promiscuous and weightless, end quote. The poetic consciousness shares unconflicted the fundaments of both. In a similarly intuitive orchestration of elements, Crossings 32, the stepping stones of a cozy become, quote, stations of the soul, end quote, and the clothes left by the turf cutters on one side of the burn might have been cast off by the crossing souls. This scene, which is rife with liminalities and precarious balances, at the water's edge is actually cherished by the speaker who claims, quote, it steadies me to tell these things, end quote. I believe that in Squarings, the poet's mind emerges in new transparency and porousness, uniquely attuned to and receptive to its environment. And it is this poetic example and lyrical experience which can cultivate our own capacity of reflection, wonder, as well as our sense of belonging, connectedness, and responsibility. I'd like to finish my part of the presentation by reading Lightning's 6, where the process of consciousness coming to its force and self-recognizing expansion is explored, as Thomas Hardy is introduced as a child out in a field of sheep. So here's the loose end. Once, as a child out in a field of sheep, Thomas Hardy pretended to be dead and lay down flat among their dainty shins. In that sniffed at, bleated into grassy space, he experimented with infinity. His small, cool brow was like an anvil, waiting for sky to make it sing the perfect pitch of his dumb being. And that stir he caused in the fleece hustle was the original of a ripple that would travel 80 years outward from there to be the same ripple inside him at its last circumference. And it is the same ripple which in his poem sends further outward, and it is the same grassy space which he extends to us so that we can take a turn in experimenting with our own position vis-a-vis our environment and find the perfect pitch and frequency when communicating with it. Now, focusing upon poetry as a medium and space which might become a catalyst for environmental action is the central concern of this presentation. The following 2 studies will present 2 class projects which were inspired by this understanding of poetry's impact. Both are examples of a curated anthology which, as a final class assignment, was designed with the aim to maximize our recognition of poetry's contemplative and transforming potential, with less emphasis on the scholar's interpretive intervention. This anthology consisted of a brief introduction discussing the student's rationale for selecting the primary text, and then 6 poems, each accompanied by the student's commentary reflecting this rationale. And I believe Judy is ready to tell you a bit about her anthology and her project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucie. I'll just share my screen as well.
You can see it now.
Perfect. Alrighty. So in my anthology titled Sacred Earth, I had analyzed 6 Irish poets who had used poetry to relocate themselves from a collective feeling of helplessness and being lost that can be seen in our growing attitudes towards climate change today. Half of the battle when it comes to making changes in our lives is feeling empowered enough to do so in the first place. In regards to climate change, it's easy to feel as though we are, quote, too far gone, which often leads to us not taking any action at all as we feel helpless to our situations. But for my part of this presentation today, I aim to qualify poetry as a bridge to re-access our empathy and hope so that we may find a renewed desire to care despite the gravity of the changing climate. The main idea behind my anthology is inspired by the article An Art That Knows Its Mind by Eugene O'Brien. In it, he details how the people of Ireland lost trust in the Catholic Church in the wake of the exposure of corruption within the institution. This event spurred poets to find a new way to access their spirituality without the Church's guidance. This quote here describes this process of finding a new language to speak and or connect to a higher purpose that has since felt lost. In finding this different perspective on the immanent, these writers essentially found God not in the walls of the church, but in the nature around them. The resulting works are reverent and full of love for the land, and a heightened awareness and connectedness to the earth, as detailed later by O'Brien as he analyzes the works of Seamus Heaney. Though this article was written from the lens of religion, I believe this sentiment also applies to climate action. In the same way that these poets were able to rediscover a pathway to a higher connection, we may also utilize poetry to rediscover an attentiveness to nature around us, to find our own personal ways to feel responsibility and protect that which surrounds us. Poetry often aims to touch the soul and speak to the innate feelings we often don't have the vocabulary to describe. A medium that can reach so deeply within the individual has the power to inspire at our most basic and fundamental levels. This very issue of caring for something we may or may not reap benefits from can be seen in Seamus Heaney's poem, St. Kevin and the Blackbird, which I will now show excerpts from and delve a little bit into. So this first section describes St. Kevin in a state of prayer within a tower, with his arms outstretched a window until a blackbird lands in his palms and lives in the palm of his hands until its young have now been born and flown away. I particularly want to highlight the last few lines in this first half of the poem, which read, "And finding himself ingrained into the network of eternal life is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hands like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown." The responsibility he finds to care for these birds is not framed as a choice. He must hold his hand out, as his connection to these creatures runs deeper than any sacrifice he might have to make to protect them. A difficult decision that perhaps mirrors our choice to invest our energy in preserving nature. In the second part, it now breaks the fourth wall and addresses the reader directly to ask them to place themselves in St. Kevin's shoes. Quote, "Imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful or in agony all the time from the neck on out down through his hurting forearms." This highlights the pain of this kind of decision, this weight that you carry on behalf of something that cannot speak for itself. Imagining the sudden care and acknowledging that despite this, Kevin still continues on. It asks us to reflect upon ourselves and ask if we are able to do this as well. And in this final section, this is what fully brings home the truth behind such care, which is that to feel responsible for something beyond us is to, quote, labor and not seek reward, something that despite the struggle can still be fulfilling, something that, when given the entirety of our beings, becomes second nature to us, a glimpse of the innate desire to love. When applying this into the context of climate change, this sentiment can be enough to open our eyes and give us a much needed different perspective, as described earlier in the previous quote from Eugene O'Brien. I'll close out my section here by reading to you this quote, also from An Art That Knows Its Mind, which reads, "The transcendent is available to us in our everyday life by looking for glimpses, glimmerings, sightings, feelings, and sensings, shards of the numinous in the ordinary world. Heaney offers insights into our life that are not readily available." I think that this quote describes very aptly this desire we have to care, and that if we were to look around us just a little bit harder, we may be able to reignite that within ourselves. And I believe that poetry is a great way to start that reignition. I will now pass my presentation off to Levi.
Thank you, Judy. Let me just share my screen here. So I will be presenting on my anthology that I created. It's titled "A Change in the Climate: Natural Imagery and Identity in Irish Poetry from 1960 to 2010." Oh, there we go. Nature and natural imagery are quite foundational themes in the Irish poetic tradition. Some of the oldest Irish poetry that has been found, like this one on the right of the screen here, the Scribe from the 9th century, uses natural imagery in a very sophisticated manner. You can already see use of it as symbol and metaphor in this poem. As I participated in Mrs. Kotesovska's poetry class, seeing these foundational themes, I began to wonder how the relationship to the land in Irish poetry, modern Irish poetry, has changed in the advent of climate change. Can the modern poet still find a stable connection to a changing landscape? So in my anthology, I set out to sort of investigate how the poet's connection to the land has shifted between the years 1960 and 2010 in the advent of climate change. In order to sort of demonstrate any shifts in this poetic landscape, I noticed the anthology and also my presentation today will be in chronological order, tracking any changes seen in the poetry. I'll be reading 3 poems selected from the anthology for everyone today. I'll be starting with Patrick Kavanagh's The One, moving on to Paul Durkin's Combe Flory, and then ending with Paula Meehan's Death of a Field. I chose each of these 3 poems as I think they're particularly demonstrative of the changes that have happened in Irish poetry in the latter half of the 20th century. So I'll go ahead and start with Patrick Kavanagh's The One. And the imagery here in the background has been chosen as it relates to the imagery that is described in the poem. Green, blue, yellow, and red. God is down in the swamps and marshes, sensational as April and almost incredible, the flowering of our catharsis. A humble scene in a backward place, where no one important ever looked. The raving flowers looked up in the face of the one and the endless, the mind that is balked. The profoundest of mortals, a primrose, a violet, a violent wild iris, but most importantly, mostly anonymous performers, yet an important occasion as the muse at her toilet, prepared to inform the local farmers that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful God was breathing his love by a cutaway bog. So Patrick Kavanagh's The One was published in 1964 and is the oldest poem I've included in my anthology. Much as Judy's presentation was discussing, it really demonstrates how the Irish poet really found connection to divinity through the natural environment, right? So we get a lot of divine language in this poem. God is down in the swamps and marshes, sensational as April and almost incredible as the flowering of our catharsis, that kind of thing. So you can really see how Kavanagh uses nature as a means of connecting to his own spirituality. The poem itself was chosen for the anthology to act as a sort of baseline in Irish poetry, right? As a yardstick to measure changes against. It's very traditional in its styling, which makes it work as a great starting point. As I said, the reverence the speaker shows to nature is very evident in the divine language he uses, right? Constant references to divine imagery in tandem with natural imagery. And also, a lot of the time, the language the speaker uses to describe not only the environment itself, but the people who appreciate it, suggests that it's mostly appreciated by the common man, right? If no one important has ever looked on this bog, will anyone important care what happens to it? So I find that almost as foreshadowing for what is to come. The next poem I'd like to talk about is Paul Durkin's Combe Flory. I'll read that for you. Wilderness that not always would deliver, but to us come from the hot clink of London. It was Tel Aviv, the hill of spring and garden of the sea. To wake in the mornings and to hear the stillness, and that in spite or because of the racket of birds, more than one, woodpecker inhabited the oak outside my window, and at 6 each morning wound up their clocks in a loud manner. Not to speak of the wood pigeons, the cuckoo, the others whose names I do not know. I said to the woman of the house in my own painful and bolder fashion, it is a crying shame to be a creature of this earth and not know the names of the birds in the trees. And yet I know the names of 50 motor cars. So Combe Flory, being published in 1975, was chosen as a sort of midway point in the transformation from the more traditional nature Irish poetry to what we see coming out recently. Relevant themes here. There's still a little bit of that divine language, right? Tel Aviv, there's a reference to, that's a place in, I believe it's near Jerusalem. I could be wrong about that, though. Regardless, it is a religiously significant area, right? And of course, industrialism overtaking the natural world there. Wilderness that not always would deliver, but come to us from hot clink of London, right? And I find it interesting. There's a lot of language here that creates what I call these Sisyphean parallels, right? Multiple times throughout the poem, Durkin uses references to boulders and pain, right? Which, in my mind, conjures the image of the mythic Greek figure Sisyphus, who was forced to push a boulder up a hill until it inevitably rolls down again in an endless cycle of torment. Which is not really the most hopeful way to look at maintaining a connection to the land, but it really shows how much of a tremendous effort it is. And also, when I first submitted this poem as an entry to my anthology, Mrs. Kotesovska suggested that the speaker and the woman not knowing the names of the birds in the trees could be viewed more as a new beginning rather than a loss of something. So I think when I'm reading this poem, I'm really thinking of it as we must set aside our traditional means of connecting to the land and forge new ones for our modern era, right? And I think that really supports that reading. The next poem I'll be reading, like I said, is Death of a Field by Paula Meehan. The field itself is lost the morning it becomes the site. When the notice goes up, Fingal County Council, 44 houses. The memory of the field is lost with the loss of its herbs, though the wood pigeons in the willow and the finches in what's left of the hawthorn hedge and the wagtail in the elder sing on their hungry summer song. The magpies sound like flying castanets, and the memory of the field disappears with its flora. Who can know the yearning of yarrow or the plight of the scarlet pimpernel, whose true color is orange? And the end of the field is the end of the hidey holes, where first smokes, first tokes, first gropes were had to the scentless mayweed. The end of the field as we know it is the start of the estate, the site to be planted with houses, each 2 or 3 bedroom, nest of sorrow and chemical, cargo of joy. The end of the dandelion is the start of flash. The end of the dock is start of pledge. The end of teasel is the start of aerial. The end of primrose is the start of brillo. The end of thistle is the start of bounce. The end of slow is the start of oxy action. The end of herb Robert is the start of brasso. The end of eyebright is the start of fairy. Who amongst us is able to number the end of grasses, the number the losses of each seeding head? I'll walk out once, barefoot under the moon, to know the field through the soles of my feet, to hear the myriad leaves, green and singing, the million cycles of being in wing. That, before the field becomes solely map memory, in some archive of some architect's screen, I might possess it, or it possess me. Through its night dew, its moon-white call, its slick and shine, and its prolificacy, in every wing beat, in every beat of time. So, Death of a Field is one of the more recent poems I included in the anthology, only published in 2005. I believe that makes it the second youngest that was in there. Relevant themes are including really the loss of the field, not only as a loss to nature, but as a loss of an important cultural place, right, within the town. You can see, I think that's really demonstrated well in the quote there. There's a very strong, active voice in Death of a Field. It mourns the loss of the field and disdains the chemicals that will pollute the land. You can really see the drive to reclaim nature and what it represents in the poetic tradition, especially near the end of the poem when Meehan, or the speaker, is saying that she would like the field to possess the field, or the field possess her, right? So in this mourning of the field, I believe the speaker reaches out towards the audience in a sort of call to action, right? Creating empathy with the land makes us want to fight for it. So sort of an overview here of the changes I personally noticed. There's a big change in mood, right? Starting with the one, it's reverent, peaceful, right? But by the time we get to Death of a Field, it's a bit more bleak, right? A bit more actionable. And even in Combe Flory, you're seeing shades of that, right? With Durkin, or the speaker's despair at what they're beginning to lose. There's also the shift in that passive voice to a more active voice, right? Modern poets really come at this from an angle of wanting to provoke an emotional response or a physical response, make the reader feel and want to act, right? So I'm thinking sort of the role of modern nature poetry here is to provide a space for reflection. Creating this space allows us to reflect upon the world in its current state and how our actions or lack of action has led it to be here, right? But in recognizing our responsibility for the earth around us, we realize as well that we can act to change it. That in this way, we provoke action using poetry, right? It makes us want to work towards a better future, especially when combined with a tone of hope. So I just wanted to end today with a poem, an original poem I wrote in a hope to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about here. So if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read it. This is Reaching Forward by myself. The salmon swims slowly through his home of brown and green, weakened, hungry, dying. He turns his gaze upward towards a world he dare not seek. Life distorts, rippling with movement just beyond reach, a spark. The future lies up ahead, only at the cost of abandoning the world he knows and hoping for something better. The surface breaks. Two worlds shatter. New life awaits. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.